Clara Weston stood at the edge of the dusty town square, clutching her last 30 cents in a worn leather pouch. The coin felt heavy in her palm, heavier than it should, for such a small amount. Around her, ranchers, in their finest hats and polished boots, surveyed the auction items with calculated eyes, their voices carrying the easy confidence of men who had never worried about their next meal. The auctioneer, a thin man named Patterson, whose voice cracked when he grew excited, wiped sweat from his brow as he gestured toward the final lot. Now then, we come to Widow Henderson's barn. Built sturdy 20 years back, though it's seen somewhere. His voice lacked conviction, and several ranchers chuckled. Clara studied the structure from where she stood. The barn listed slightly to one side, its weathered boards hanging loose like broken teeth. Faint had long since surrendered to wind and rain, leaving grey wood that looked ready to collapse at the next strong gust. Every sensible person could see it was worthless, but Clara had noticed something during her inspection the week before. The morning light had struck the back wall at just the right angle, revealing marks that shouldn't exist on ordinary wood, scratches that formed deliberate patterns, carved deep enough to survive decades of weather. She had traced them with her finger, feeling the intentional grooves, recognizing something her late husband Thomas had once shown her in his surveyor's books. "Do I hear 50 cents?" Patterson called out. The silence stretched uncomfortable and long. A few ranchers shook their heads, dismissing the structure entirely. Gideon Blackthorne, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, adjusted his expensive hat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Patterson, you'd have better luck selling a pile of kindling. That thing's been rotting for years." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression calm. These men saw only what they expected to see: decay and worthlessness. They had walked past this barn countless times without truly looking. 25 cents then, Patterson's voice grew more desperate. More silence. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was madness. She needed that money for food, for rent on her tiny cabin. But those carved patterns haunted her thoughts, and Thomas's voice echoed in her memory. "Clara, love, sometimes the most valuable things hide in the places others refuse to look." She raised her trembling hand. 30 cents. Every head turned toward her. The silence that followed felt different now, charged with surprise and mockery. Several ranchers exchanged glances before breaking into grins. Gideon Blackthorne's laugh boomed across the square. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like we found someone even more desperate than Patterson." He tipped his hat toward her with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. Weston, isn't it? The former schoolteacher who got herself dismissed for filling children's heads with foolish notions." Clara's jaw tightened. "The bid is 30 cents, Mr. Patterson." Clara, Gideon continued, his voice carrying false sympathy. "That barn's nothing but a pile of rot. You'd be throwing away your last coins on lumber that won't even burn clean." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "Besides, what would a widow woman do with property like that? You can barely maintain that cabin you're renting." The crowd murmured agreement. Clara felt their judgment settling on her shoulders like dust, but she straightened her spine. 30 cents, she repeated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand. Patterson looked around desperately for other bidders, but found none. The barn was clearly worthless, and no one wanted to encourage Clara's foolishness by driving up the price. "Going once," Patterson called, his voice reluctant. "Going twice." A longer pause. "Sold to Miss Weston for 30 cents. The key felt warm in Clara's palm as Patterson handed it over, his expression apologetic. Around her, ranchers continued their conversations, already forgetting the auction's end. But Gideon lingered, studying her with eyes that held more calculation than amusement. "Mark my words, Clara," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Some things are left alone for good reason. Smart folks learn to recognize when they're in over their heads." As the crowd dispersed, Clara pocketed the key and tried to ignore the flicker of excitement building in her chest. The barn might look worthless to them, but she had seen something they missed. Those carved patterns meant something, and she intended to discover what. The afternoon sun hung low as Clara rode her borrowed mare toward the barn, kicking up dust that settled on her worn dress. Behind her, the town grew smaller, its sounds fading until only the wind remained. The barn stood crooked against the horizon, looking even more decrepit from a distance. Up close, the structure defied every expectation. While the exterior showed decades of neglect, loose boards, peeling paint, a foundation that had shifted with time, something felt wrong about its apparent fragility. Clara dismounted and approached the heavy wooden door, noting how solid it remained, despite the building's shabby appearance. The key turned easily in the lock, too easily for a mechanism that should have rusted years ago. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo longer than it should, revealing an interior that made Clara catch her breath. The barn's inside contradicted everything its exterior promised. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, but beneath the layer of neglect, the bones of the structure stood straight and true. Floorboards, though dusty, showed no signs of rot. Support beams rose toward the roof, without sag or warp, bearing no evidence of the decay that should have claimed them. Clara stepped inside, her boots echoing in the vast space. The sound carried clearly, too resonant for a building that appeared ready to collapse. She moved deeper into the barn, toward the back wall where she had glimpsed those strange markings from outside. The patterns were even more intriguing up close. Carved deep into the wood, they formed deliberate symbols that resembled the surveyor's marks Thomas had shown her in his reference books. Not random scratches left by animals or weather, but precise indicators that someone had wanted to preserve important information. Her heart began to race as she traced the patterns with her finger. These were the marks used to identify mineral deposits or water sources, the secret language surveyors used to record valuable discoveries. But they were carved inside the barn, hidden from casual observation, which meant whoever placed them wanted to keep the information secret. As Clara examined the symbols more closely, she noticed other oddities. The hay scattered across the floor seemed too deliberately arranged, as if concealing something beneath. When she pushed aside a loose beam near the wall, a hidden mechanism creaked, wood sliding against wood with the sound of careful craftsmanship. Behind the beam, etched into a plank that had been concealed for decades, she found the faint outline of what looked like a blueprint. Lines and measurements that suggested this barn held secrets far more valuable than anyone imagined. "Foolish boy," the voice from outside made Clara freeze. Through the gaps in the wall she could see Gideon Blackthorne approaching on his black stallion, his expensive hat casting shadows across his weathered face. Clara quickly released the beam, letting it slide back into place, and moved away from the wall as Gideon appeared in the doorway. "Throwing away your last coins on this pile of rotting wood," he continued, dismounting with practiced ease. "You could have used that money for a decent meal." Clara stepped toward the center of the barn, careful not to reveal what she had been examining. Sometimes what looks worthless on the surface holds the greatest value underneath, Mr. Blackthorne. Gideon's laugh was harsh, echoing off the barn walls. "Value. The only value here is in teaching you a lesson about knowing your place. This barn has stood empty for good reason. Even Widow Henderson was glad to be rid of it." He walked deeper into the barn, his spurs ringing against the floorboards. Clara noticed how his eyes moved constantly, taking in details most people would miss. This wasn't a casual visit. Gideon was studying the structure with the same intensity she had shown. "Mark my words, Clara," he said, turning to face her with eyes that held no trace of humor. "Some things are left alone for good reason. Smart people learn to recognize when they're in over their heads." The warning hung in the air long after his footsteps faded outside, but instead of frightening her, Gideon's interest only strengthened Clara's resolve. He wouldn't have come here, wouldn't have issued warnings, unless he suspected the barn held more than it appeared to. As his horse's hoofbeats disappeared toward town, Clara returned to the carved symbols on the wall. The afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the boards, illuminating the dust motes that danced like secrets waiting to be revealed. Somewhere in this barn lay the answer to why powerful men wanted to keep others from looking too closely at what they quickly dismissed as worthless. That evening, Clara sat outside the small cabin she rented at the edge of town, studying the sketches she had made of the barn's symbols by lamplight. The carved patterns nagged at her memory. She was certain Thomas had shown her similar markings in his surveyor's journals, but those books had been sold with everything else after his death. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Violet Ramirez stood at her door, holding a covered basket that smelled of fresh tortillas. Her simple dress was modest but clean, and her dark eyes held the intelligence that most people in town overlooked, because they saw only her Mexican heritage. "Evening, Clara. I heard about your purchase today. The whole town's talking." Clara quickly covered her sketches as Violet settled into the chair beside her. "My father says you're either brave or foolish. He hasn't decided which yet. What do you think?" Clara asked, studying her friend's face in the flickering lamplight. Violet was one of the few people who had ever shown Clara genuine kindness after Thomas's death, when others treated her widowhood like a contagious disease. She was also one of the smartest people Clara knew, despite being dismissed by most townsfolk as just the storekeeper's daughter. "I think you see things others don't," Violet said carefully. "Remember when you warned us about that storm last spring? Everyone said you were imagining things until the hail destroyed half the crops." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You found something in that barn, didn't you?" Clara's hesitation was answer enough. She glanced around to make sure they were alone, then revealed her sketches. These symbols were carved into the wall. They looked like surveyor's marks, but I'm not certain what they mean. Violet studied the drawings with the same intensity Clara had shown at the barn. "My grandfather was a surveyor before we lost our land. He showed me marks like these when I was young." She pointed to one of the symbols. "This one indicates water, not just any water, but a source that runs deep and strong." Clara's pulse quickened. In a territory where water rights determined wealth and power, such a discovery would be worth more than gold. "Be careful, Clara." Violet's expression grew serious. "There are people in this town who don't want anyone else to succeed, especially someone they consider beneath them." Before Clara could respond, she continued, "Gideon Blackthorne came by our store tonight, asked a lot of questions about you, wanted to know about your family, your background. My father told him to mind his own business, but..." She hesitated. "Gideon seemed very interested in why you would spend your last coins on something everyone else considered worthless." The weight of Violet's words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. If Gideon was already investigating her purchase, it meant he suspected the barn held value beyond its appearance. "He visited me at the barn this afternoon," Clara admitted. "Warned me that some things are left alone for good reason." Violet's eyes widened. "He went to the barn, Clara. That's not like him. Gideon Blackthorne doesn't waste time on worthless property." She reached over and gripped Clara's hand. "Whatever you found in there, it's important enough to worry him. But why would he care about an old barn?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because men like Gideon have built their empires by making sure no one else succeeds. He's taken land from half the families in this territory, including mine." Violet's voice hardened. "3 years ago, he claimed our water rights through some legal trickery my father couldn't fight. We went from owning a ranch to working in his store." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. If the barn's secret involved water rights, and if Gideon suspected what she had found, then she was in more danger than she had realized. "What should I do?" she asked. Violet squeezed her hand tighter. "Don't let him intimidate you, but don't go to that barn alone anymore either. If you're right about those symbols, you've found something that could change everything for people like us." She paused, her dark eyes flashing with determination. "And I want to help. Whatever fight is coming, I'm on your side." As Violet prepared to leave, she turned back with one final warning. "Sheriff Briggs stopped by the store today too, asking questions about you. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder. I think Gideon got to him first. After Violet left, Clara sat alone under the stars, staring at her sketches. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with meaning in the lamplight, promising secrets that could either lift her from poverty or destroy her entirely. Tomorrow she would need to return to the barn and continue her investigation. But Violet's words echoed in her mind. Whatever she had stumbled upon was important enough to worry the most powerful man in the territory. The question was whether she possessed the courage to uncover what previous owners had kept hidden, knowing that Gideon Blackthorne would do anything to stop her. Clara returned to the barn the next evening carrying a small oil lamp and her late husband's surveyor's compass. The setting sun painted the weathered structure in shades of gold and crimson, making it appear almost beautiful despite its decrepit facade. She had spent the day at the general store with Violet, poring over old territorial maps and trying to match the carved symbols to known geological features. The barn door stood slightly ajar. Clara's blood turned to ice. She distinctly remembered locking it before leaving yesterday. Her hand moved instinctively to the key in her pocket, confirming it was still there. Someone else had been inside her property. She pushed the door open slowly, holding the lamp high. Its flickering light revealed a figure, crouched near the back wall, examining the same carved symbols that had captured her attention. The man was lean and weathered, dressed in a dusty coat and worn boots. His dark hair showed traces of grey, and his hands moved with the careful precision of someone who understood what he was looking at. "Step away from there," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The stranger straightened slowly, turning to face her with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. His eyes held intelligence and something else, a weariness that suggested he had seen too much of the world's harsh realities. "Easy now, ma'am. I'm not here to cause trouble." His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place, cultured but roughened by years of travel. "Name's Elias Crow. I believe you and I have a mutual interest in this old barn." "This is my property," Clara said firmly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You're trespassing." Elias nodded toward the carved symbols. "Those marks you've been studying, do you know what they mean?" Clara hesitated. Admitting her interest would reveal how much she had discovered, but denying it would be pointless given her obvious investigations. "I have some idea," she said carefully. "I worked for the man who carved them." Elias moved slowly away from the wall, his manner non-threatening but alert. "Josiah Wheeler built this barn 22 years ago, though most folks thought he was just another eccentric with more money than sense." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the way Elias spoke it suggested reverence mixed with regret. Josiah was an itum, a dreamer, had ideas about harnessing resources that others couldn't see or didn't understand. Elias gestured toward the symbols. "These marks aren't just random carvings. They're a map, Mrs. Weston, a guide to something Josiah discovered but never had the chance to fully exploit." Clara felt her breath catch. What kind of something? Elias studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Wealth greater than gold, resources that could transform this entire territory, make the difference between prosperity and poverty for generations. Then why didn't this Josiah Wheeler claim it for himself? Because he died before he could complete his work. Elias's expression darkened. Some say it was an accident. Others whispered about men who didn't want him sharing his discoveries with the wrong people. A chill ran down Clara's spine. Men like Gideon Blackthorne. Gideon was younger then, hungrier. He'd just started building his empire by buying up water rights and foreclosing on struggling ranchers. Josiah's discovery threatened that monopoly. Elias moved closer to the lamplight, revealing scars on his hands and a face marked by years of hard travel. "I was Josiah's apprentice, helped him with his surveys and calculations. When he died, I've been drifting ever since, too afraid to come back and finish what we started." Clara felt torn between fascination and distrust. This stranger's story explained much, but it also raised dangerous possibilities. "Why are you telling me this? Why come back now?" Because you bought the barn. Because you've already started uncovering what Josiah hid. And because, he hesitated, because I'm tired of running from the truth. Maybe it's time someone with courage finished what he began. How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you're not working for Blackthorn? Elias reached into his coat slowly, producing a worn leather journal. This belonged to Josiah, contains his notes, his calculations, sketches of the machinery he designed. He held it out to her. Everything you need to understand what those symbols really mean. Clara stared at the journal, but didn't reach for it. Accepting it would be crossing a line, committing herself to a path that might lead to wealth or destruction. Think carefully, Mrs. Weston, Elias said quietly. Once you know the truth, there's no going back. Gideon Blackthorn has killed to protect his interests before. He won't hesitate to do it again if he thinks you pose a threat. The weight of his words settled over the barn like dust. Clara understood that she stood at a crossroads. She could walk away now, abandon her investigation, and return to her simple life of quiet poverty. Or she could take the journal and step into a world where the stakes were life and death. She reached for the leather-bound book 3 days later. Clara sat in the barn's dusty interior, poring over Josiah Wheeler's journal by lamplight. The pages revealed a mind of extraordinary vision and meticulous planning. Wheeler had documented not just the location of underground water sources, but also mineral deposits that could revolutionize mining in the territory. His sketches showed strange mechanical devices designed to harness natural forces in ways Clara barely understood. But most intriguing were the detailed maps showing a network of underground streams and mineral veins that converged directly beneath the barn's foundation. According to Wheeler's calculations, the right machinery could tap into resources worth more than all of Blackthorn's holdings combined. Heavy footsteps on the wooden floor made her look up. Gideon Blackthorn stood in the doorway, his imposing frame silhouetted against the evening sky. 2 of his men flanked him, hard-faced ranch hands, whose reputations for violence were well known throughout the territory. Clara quickly closed the journal and slipped it beneath a pile of hay, trying to keep her expression neutral despite the fear clawing at her chest. Mrs. Weston, Gideon said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was riding past and noticed your lamp, thought I'd check on your investment. He stepped into the barn, his boots echoing on the floorboards. His men remained by the entrance, blocking any escape route. Clara noticed how Gideon's eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the barn's interior. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, he continued, his voice friendly but with an underlying edge, about smart folks knowing their limitation. It occurs to me that you might be struggling financially. What with your reduced circumstances? Clara stood slowly, keeping the pile of hay between herself and the hidden journal. I'm managing well enough, thank you. Gideon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course you are, but I'm a generous man, Clara. May I call you Clara? I'd like to make you an offer that could solve all your problems. He reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. $5 for this barn, this land, everything. That's more than 100 times what you paid for it. The amount was staggering. $5 would cover Clara's rent for months, buy food and necessities she desperately needed. But the fact that Gideon was offering so much only confirmed the barn's true value. That's very generous, she said carefully, but I'm not interested in selling. The friendly mask slipped from Gideon's face. I beg your pardon. I said I'm not selling. This barn is my property, legally purchased, and I intend to keep it. Gideon's hand tightened around the money pouch. Clara, I don't think you understand the situation. This is the best offer you're going to get. In fact, it's the only offer you're going to get. He stepped closer, and Clara caught the scent of expensive whiskey on his breath. You see, I know things about this old barn. things that might make ownership dangerous for someone in your position. What kinds of things? The kind that got Josiah Wheeler killed. Gideon's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Wheeler thought he was clever, thought he could hide his discoveries from men who understood how power really works in this territory. He was wrong. Clara felt ice form in her stomach, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackthorne? I'm educating you. There are accidents in this territory, Clara. Barn fires, people who disappear while traveling alone, tragic circumstances that befall folks who don't know their place. The two ranch hands shifted slightly, their hands resting casually near their weapons. The message was unmistakable, but instead of the fear Gideon expected, Clara felt anger beginning to burn in her chest. This man had intimidated and destroyed countless families, including Violet's. He had built his empire on the suffering of others, and now he expected her to simply surrender because he had issued threats. Get off my property, she said quietly. Gideon's eyebrows rose in surprise. I'm sorry, what did you say? I said get off my property, you and your men. Now, the silence that followed felt dangerous. Gideon's face darkened, and his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually strike her. Instead, he smiled, a cold expression that held no trace of humor. You know, Clara, I had hoped we could resolve this like civilized people. But some folks insist on learning lessons the hard way. He turned toward the door, pausing to look back at her. I'll give you 3 days to reconsider my generous offer. After that, he shrugged. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. As the sound of their horses faded into the distance, Clara sank to her knees beside the pile of hay, her hands shaking as she retrieved Wheeler's journal. She had stood up to the most powerful man in the territory, but she knew it was only the beginning. Gideon Blackthorne didn't make idle threats, and he wouldn't tolerate defiance from someone he considered beneath his notice. That night, she would need to find Violet and warn her about what was coming. Because Clara had chosen her side in a war she was only beginning to understand. The next morning, Clara arrived at the barn before dawn, accompanied by Violet and Elias Crow. She had spent the night at Violet's family home, too frightened to return to her isolated cabin after Gideon's threats. Violet's father, Miguel Ramirez, had insisted on lending them his best shovel and pickaxe, along with a stern warning to be careful. If Josiah Wheeler really hid something valuable here, Violet said, examining the journal's detailed sketches, it would have to be somewhere protected from weather and casual discovery. Elias knelt beside the pile of hay where Clara had hidden the journal, running his hands along the floorboards. Josiah was methodical about everything. He wouldn't have left his life's work exposed to chance. His fingers found an irregularity in the wood. Here, this board's been cut and replaced. Working together, they pried up the loose planks, revealing a hollow space beneath the barn's foundation. Clara held the lamp low while Elias and Violet cleared away years of accumulated dirt and debris. Sweet Mary and Joseph. Violet whispered. The hollow contained mechanical devices, unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Gears and pulleys crafted from brass and steel, their surfaces green with age, but showing no signs of rust. Intricate pipes and valves connected to chambers that seemed designed to harness pressure from underground sources. But most remarkable were the maps. Dozens of them, rolled in oiled leather and preserved perfectly despite the years. Wheeler had documented not just local water sources, but mineral deposits throughout the territory. Silver veins, copper lodes, and something marked repeatedly as liquid wealth in locations that corresponded to where oil seepage had been reported. Josiah wasn't just an inventor, Elias said, his voice filled with awe. He was ahead of his time by decades. He understood that this territory sat on resources that wouldn't be valuable for years to come. Clara unrolled one of the larger maps, studying Wheeler's careful notations. According to his calculations, the land beneath and around the barn contained enough water to irrigate thousands of acres, enough minerals to supply mining operations for generations. But why hide it all here? Violet asked, examining one of the strange mechanical devices. Why not exploit the discoveries himself? Because he knew what would happen if the wrong people found out, Elias replied grimly. Men like Gideon would have killed him for this information, then used it to consolidate even more power. Josiah believed these resources should benefit the whole community, not just the wealthy few. A new voice spoke from the barn's entrance. Noble sentiment. Pity had got him killed. Sheriff Alcott Briggs stood silhouetted against the morning light, his hand resting on his gun butt. Behind him, Clara could see several of Gideon's men positioned outside the barn. Sheriff Briggs, Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. This is private property. I'm afraid there's been a complaint, Mrs. Weston. Blackthorn reports suspicious activity, possible theft of valuable materials. Briggs stepped into the barn, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between competing loyalties. I need to ask you folks to step away from whatever you've found there. Violet moved protectively closer to Clara. Sheriff, you know this is Clara's legal property. She has every right to investigate what's on her own land. Maybe so, but I also have reports of trespassing, conspiracy and destruction of property. Serious charges that require investigation. Briggs's voice carried reluctance, but also the weight of official authority. Elias stood slowly, his hands visible and empty. Sheriff, you know what this is really about. Gideon Blackthorn wants to steal what doesn't belong to him, same as he's done to half the families in this territory. What I know, Briggs replied, is that I've got a job to do, and that job is keeping the peace. Right now, that means making sure nobody gets hurt over whatever's hidden in this barn. Heavy footsteps announced Gideon's arrival. He entered the barn with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way, flanked by two of his largest ranch hands. Sheriff, I appreciate your prompt response. Gideon's gaze moved hungrily over the exposed mechanical devices and map. As you can see, there's been significant excavation on this property. I have reason to believe these items may be stolen goods. That's a lie, Clara said, stepping forward despite the fear coursing through her veins. This is my property, legally purchased. Whatever was hidden here belongs to me. Gideon smiled coldly. Actually, Mrs. Weston, I think you'll find the legal situation is more complicated than you realize. You see, I've been researching the original deed to this land. It seems there may have been irregularities in Widow Henderson's ownership, questions about water rights and mineral claims that were never properly resolved. Clara's heart sank. She had feared something like this. Gideon's legal manipulations were legendary throughout the territory. However, Gideon continued, I'm still willing to make my generous offer. $5 for the barn and land, plus I'll over the barn and land, plus I'll overlook any questions about the, shall we say, archaeological work you've been conducting. The silence that followed felt charged with danger. Clara looked at Sheriff Briggs, seeing the conflict in his eyes. She realized that whatever she said next would determine not just her own fate, but the future of Wheeler's discoveries and the power they represented. I need time to consider, she said finally. Gideon's smile widened. Of course, but don't take too long. Legal complications have a way of becoming more expensive the longer they're delayed. He gestured toward his men. I'll post some guards to ensure the integrity of the evidence until this matter is resolved. As they prepared to leave, Gideon paused beside the exposed hollow. Remarkable work, this. Wheeler always was clever. Too bad he didn't live to see his discoveries put to proper use. After they were gone, Sheriff Briggs lingered, his expression troubled. Clara, I'm sorry about this, but Gideon's got lawyers, money, influence. If you're smart, you'll take his offer and walk away. And if I don't, Briggs met her eyes, and she saw genuine concern there. Then God help you, because I might not be able to. As the sheriff departed, Clara stood among Wheeler's hidden treasures, feeling the weight of impossible choices. The secret that could transform the territory now threatened to destroy her. But looking at the mechanical marvels and detailed maps, she knew she couldn't simply surrender them to Gideon's greed. The war for the barn's secrets had begun in earnest. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flame. She bolted upright in her narrow bed, her heart hammering as orange light danced through her cabin window. The barn. Someone was burning the barn. She threw on her clothes and ran barefoot across the rough ground, her nightgown billowing behind her as she raced toward the inferno that had once been her property. Flames consumed the weathered boards with vast hunger, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. The structure that had hidden Josiah Wheeler's secrets for 2 decades was being devoured before her eyes. Through the smoke and heat, she could see Gideon's men positioned around the perimeter, not fighting the fire, but ensuring no one interfered with its destructive work. They watched with the satisfaction of soldiers completing a successful mission. "Clara!" Violet's voice cut through the roar of flames. She appeared at Clara's side, her face streaked with soot and tears of rage. "They came an hour ago, poured kerosene around the foundation, and lit it like a bonfire." "The machinery," Clara gasped. "Wheeler's maps, all of his work gone," Elias said grimly, emerging from the smoke with singed clothes and burned hands. "I tried to get inside, but the flames spread too fast. They planned this carefully, made sure the fire would reach the foundation quickly." Clara sank to her knees on the hard ground, watching decades of hidden knowledge disappear in flames and smoke. Gideon had won. He had destroyed the evidence of Wheeler's discoveries and eliminated any threat to his dominance. Without the maps and machinery, Clara had no proof of the barn's true value, no leverage against his legal manipulations. But as she watched, something extraordinary began to happen. The heat of the fire, instead of simply destroying Wheeler's hidden chamber, began to trigger mechanisms that had waited 20 years for activation. Deep beneath the burning floorboards, pressure was building in the system Wheeler had designed. The flames that were meant to erase his legacy were instead awakening it. A deep rumbling sound rose from underground, felt more than heard. The earth beneath Clara's feet began to vibrate with increasing intensity. Gideon's men looked nervously at each other, their confident expressions faltering as the ground trembled beneath their boots. "What's happening?" Violet whispered. Elias's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The fire. It's heating the pressure chambers. Josiah designed the system to respond to extreme temperatures." The rumbling grew louder, and cracks began appearing in the earth around the barn's foundation. Steam hissed from the gaps, carrying the scent of minerals and deep water. The flames seemed to dance higher, as if fed by forces rising from below. Then, with a sound like thunder breaking open the earth, the ground erupted. A geyser of crystal-clear water shot 50 feet into the air, its force so powerful it scattered burning boards like kindling. The water sparkled in the firelight, carrying traces of minerals that made it gleam like liquid silver. It fell back to earth in a shower that doused the flames and transformed the dusty ground into flowing streams. But the water was only the beginning. As the initial geyser subsided, smaller springs began emerging throughout the area, creating a network of flowing streams that had been hidden for generations. The heat from the fire had cracked open chambers that released not just water, but the pressure that drove Wheeler's mechanical systems. From the ruins of the barn, strange metallic structures began to rise, pumps and wheels and intricate clockwork mechanisms that the fire had somehow activated rather than destroyed. Steam rose from brass gears as they turned with smooth precision, channeling the underground springs into a complex irrigation system that spread across the surrounding land. Clara stood transfixed as Wheeler's true genius revealed itself. He hadn't just discovered water and minerals, he had created a system that could transform the entire territory. The fire meant to destroy his legacy had instead unveiled the most spectacular demonstration of hydraulic engineering anyone in the territory had ever witnessed. People began arriving from town, drawn by the strange lights and sounds, ranchers and storekeepers, families and children, all standing in awe as water flowed where only dust had existed moments before. Even Gideon's men abandoned their posts, staring open-mouthed at the mechanical marvel rising from the barn's ashes. "Sweet Lord," someone whispered. "It's like Moses striking the rock." Sheriff Briggs appeared at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face reflecting the flames and flowing water. Behind him came more townsfolk, including Violet's father Miguel, who crossed himself and muttered prayers in Spanish. But it was Gideon himself who pushed through the crowd with fury etched across his face. His carefully planned destruction had backfired spectacularly, revealing the very secrets he had tried to bury. Instead of eliminating Clara's claim, the fire had provided irrefutable proof of the barn's extraordinary value. "This changes nothing," he shouted over the sound of flowing water and turning gears. "This is still disputed property with unclear ownership." But his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd was mesmerized by the sight of abundant water flowing in a land that had known drought and scarcity. Parents held children up to see the miracle, and men who had struggled to irrigate their small farms wept openly at the sight of such abundance. Clara found her voice at last. "This was never about the barn," she called out, her words carrying across the gathered crowd. "This was about a vision of what this territory could become." Josiah Wheeler died protecting this discovery, not for one person's gain but for everyone's benefit. She gestured toward the flowing streams and turning mechanisms. "This water, these systems, they don't belong to me or to Gideon Blackthorne. They belong to all of us." The crowd murmured agreement, their voices growing stronger as they realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a remarkable discovery, it was hope made manifest, proof that the territory's future could be different from its harsh past. The next morning dawned, clear and bright over a transformed landscape. Where dust and struggling vegetation had existed the day before, streams of clear water now flowed through channels carved by Wheeler's ingenious system. The mechanical pumps continued their steady work, their brass gears gleaming in the sunlight as they distributed the underground bounty across acres of formerly barren land. Sheriff Alcott Briggs stood at the edge of the transformed property, watching families from town fill buckets and jars with the precious water. Children played in the shallow streams while their parents discussed the implications in hushed, excited voices. In 24 hours, Clara Weston's worthless barn had become the most important location in the territory. "Quite a sight, isn't it, Sheriff?" Briggs turned to find Gideon Blackthorne approaching, his expensive clothes and polished boots incongruous against the muddy ground. Despite the previous night's spectacular failure, Gideon's expression remained confident, even amused. "Gideon," Briggs acknowledged warily. "Hell of a thing. What happened here?" "Indeed, though I trust you haven't forgotten your duties in all the excitement." Gideon's voice carried its usual edge of authority. "We still have legal matters to resolve. Questions about property ownership, water rights, mineral claims." Briggs felt the familiar weight of compromise settling on his shoulders. For years he had maintained order by accommodating Gideon's demands, turning blind eyes to questionable business practices in exchange for relative peace. But last night had changed something fundamental in the territory's balance of power. "The way I see it," Briggs said slowly, "Miss Weston bought that property legal and square. Whatever was on it became hers by right." Gideon's smile tightened. "Sheriff, I think you're forgetting our previous conversations about maintaining stability in this territory, about the importance of experienced leadership during times of change." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Gideon had information about Briggs's past compromises, evidence that could destroy his reputation and position. But as the sheriff watched families celebrating around the flowing water, he found those old fears losing their grip. "Maybe it's time for some new leadership," Briggs said quietly. Before Gideon could respond, a commotion near the barn's ruins drew their attention. A stranger had arrived on horseback, a well-dressed man with surveyor's tools and official document. "That'll be Collins," Gideon said, his confidence returning. "Territorial surveyor I sent for. He'll sort out the legal complexities surrounding this property." But as Surveyor Collins dismounted and began examining Wheeler's exposed mechanisms, his expression showed fascination rather than the confusion Gideon had expected. He pulled out instruments and began taking careful measurements, his excitement growing with each calculation. "Remarkable," Collins muttered, studying the brass gears and water channels. "This is the Wheeler hydraulic system. I've heard rumors of it for years, but I never imagined." Gideon frowned. "You're familiar with this apparatus?" Collins looked up from his instruments with obvious enthusiasm. Josiah Wheeler was a legend among surveyors and engineers. His theories about underground pressure systems revolutionized hydraulic engineering in the Eastern Territory. We studied his designs at the Territorial College, though most of his work was thought to be lost. Clara stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered around the surveyor. "Does that affect the property ownership?" Collins consulted his documents. "Miss Weston, your purchase of this property was completely legal. More than that, Wheeler's original land grant specifically reserved water and mineral rights for whoever maintained and activated his systems. By triggering the mechanism, you fulfilled the conditions of his bequest." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the legal validation she had desperately needed materialized from an unexpected source. Gideon's face darkened with rage. "That's impossible. I researched the original deeds myself." "Mr. Blackthorne," Collins replied coolly, "Wheeler filed his grants through the territorial capital, not the local courthouse. The documents were sealed pending activation of his hydraulic systems. That activation occurred last night." Sheriff Briggs felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as he realized the implications. With federal backing for Clara's claim, even Gideon's legal manipulations would be powerless. "Furthermore," Collins continued, "Wheeler's bequest includes provisions for community access to the water systems. Mrs. Weston holds title to the land, but the water rights are held in perpetual trust for the territory's residents." Violet Ramirez pushed through the crowd, her face glowing with excitement. "Clara, do you understand what this means? Your discovery doesn't just belong to you. It belongs to all of us. The old farmers, the Mexican families, everyone Gideon has squeezed out over the years." The crowd's celebration grew louder as the full implications became clear. Gideon's monopoly on water rights had been broken by a force beyond his control or legal manipulation. But Clara could see the fury building in Gideon's eyes, the dangerous calculation of a man who had never accepted defeat. Legal authority might support her claim, but she knew Gideon Blackthorne had other ways of getting what he wanted. "This isn't over," he said quietly. His words meant for Clara alone. "Legal papers don't mean much to dead people." As he stalked away from the celebration, Clara felt a chill despite the warm sunshine. She had won the first battle, but the war for Wheeler's legacy was far from finished. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by her cabin window, watching the distant glow from the lanterns people had hung around the flowing streams. Families were camping nearby, unwilling to leave the miracle they had witnessed. The sound of flowing water and turning gears created a gentle symphony that should have been soothing, but Clara's nerves remained on edge. Gideon's parting threat echoed in her memory. She had expected him to retreat after the legal validation of her ownership, but she knew better than to underestimate his capacity for violence when legal methods failed. A soft knock at her door made her heart jump. She opened it to find Elias Crow, his face grim in the lamplight. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "Gideon and 6 of his men, armed and riding hard. They'll be here within the hour." Clara's blood turned cold. "How do you know?" "I've been watching his ranch since yesterday. When Collins arrived with those legal papers, I knew Gideon wouldn't accept defeat." Elias stepped inside, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "He's planning to end this tonight, permanently. We have to warn the families by the streams. Already done. Violet and her father are getting people to safety." Elias met her eyes. "The question is what you want to do. We could run, get you out of territory before they arrive." Clara looked through her window at the distant lights around Wheeler's flowing stream. Families who had never known water security were celebrating their first night of abundance. Children were playing in streams that yesterday had been only dust and dreams. No, she said firmly, I won't run. Wheeler died protecting this discovery, and I won't let Gideon destroy it with threats and violence. Elias studied her face in the lamplight, seeing a strength that hadn't been there when she first bought the barn. Then we make a stand. But Clara, you need to understand, Gideon's not planning to scare you tonight. He's planning to finish this. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hooves cut through the night air. But instead, at Gideon's men, Sheriff Briggs appeared at her door, accompanied by several townsmen carrying rifles and lanterns. Mrs. Weston, Briggs said, his voice carrying a determination Clara had never heard before. We received word that there might be trouble tonight. Some of us thought you could use support. Behind him stood Miguel Ramirez, the blacksmith Tom Morrison, storekeeper James Webb, and a dozen other men who had been powerless against Gideon's dominance for years. Tonight, they carried themselves differently, not as subjects afraid of their ruler, but as citizens defending their community. Sheriff, Clara said, moved by their unexpected solidarity, this could be dangerous. Gideon's not going to back down easily. Neither are we, Briggs replied. I've spent too many years looking the other way while that man destroyed lives and dreams. Wheeler's discovery belongs to this community, and we intend to protect it. The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and Clara could see torches moving through the dark. Gideon was coming with enough men to overwhelm any resistance, confident that superior numbers would end the dispute once and for all. But as his riders crested the small hill overlooking Clara's cabin, they encountered an unexpected sight. Instead of a lone woman defended only by a mysterious drifter, they faced 24 armed men positioned around the property with military precision. Gideon reined in his horse, studying the defensive positions with the eye of someone who understood warfare. His men shifted nervously, realizing their planned intimidation had become a potential battle. Briggs, Gideon called out, this is territorial business. Don't make the mistake of interfering. Sheriff Briggs stepped into the circle of lamplight, his badge gleaming on his chest and his rifle held with steady hands. The only mistake here would be yours, Gideon. Mrs. Weston's ownership has been legally validated by territorial authority. Any action against her or her property would be an attack on federal law. Federal law? Gideon laughed harshly. We're 200 miles from the nearest federal marshal. By the time anyone investigates, this matter will be long resolved. Elias moved beside Clara, his weapons visible but not threatening. Actually, Gideon, there's something you should know about those federal connections. He reached into his coat and produced an official-looking document with territorial seals. Collins wasn't just a surveyor, he was also authorized to investigate reports of illegal land seizures and water monopolization. Your business practices have attracted federal attention. The confidence drained from Gideon's face as he realized the implication. Federal investigation would expose decades of questionable deals, forged documents, and intimidation tactics. Furthermore, Elias continued, I've been documenting those practices for 3 years. Every family you've cheated, every ranch you've stolen, every death you've caused, all of it recorded and ready for federal prosecutors. Clara stared at Elias in shock. The mysterious drifter had been more than Wheeler's apprentice or a simple wanderer. He had been gathering evidence, building a case against Gideon's empire with the patience of someone seeking justice rather than revenge. Gideon's hand moved toward his weapon, but found himself facing 24 rifle barrels in the hands of men who had finally found their courage. His own men looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they faced not victims, but an organized community prepared to defend itself. This isn't over, Gideon said, his voice carrying less conviction than before. Yes, it is, Clara said, stepping forward into the lamplight. Your reign of fear ends tonight, Gideon. Wheeler's discovery doesn't just bring water to our land, it brings hope, and hope is something you can't steal or destroy. As dawn approached, Gideon and his men retreated into the darkness, their leader's empire crumbling under the weight of evidence and community resistance. The families who had hidden in fear emerged to find their protectors still standing guard, and the waters still flowing from Wheeler's miraculous system. The war for the barn's secret was finally over. 6 months later, Clara stood on the small hill where her barn had once collapsed in flames, watching the transformed landscape spread before her like a living testament to human possibility. Where dust and struggling scrub had existed before, green fields now stretched toward the horizon, nourished by the network of streams and irrigation channels that flowed from Wheeler's ingenious system. The mechanical pumps continued their steady rhythm, their brass gears catching the morning sunlight as they distributed underground bounty across what had become the most prosperous region in the territory. The town square below bustled with activity that would have been impossible just months earlier. Mexican families who had lost their land to Gideon's schemes now operated thriving vegetable gardens along the new waterway. Former ranch hands had become independent farmers, their small plots yielding crops that fed both their families and the growing marketplace. Children played in streams that ran clear and strong, their laughter carrying on air that no longer tasted of dust and desperation. Hard to believe it all started with 30 cents and a pile of rotting wood, Violet said, joining Clara on the hill. Her friend wore a simple but well-made dress, and her hands showed the honest calluses of someone who had built her own ranch from determination and flowing water. Clara smiled, remembering the mockery and derision that had greeted her purchase. Thomas always said the most valuable things hide where others are afraid to look. I just never imagined he meant this literally. Below them, Sheriff Briggs emerged from the new courthouse, a solid stone building that had replaced the cramped wooden structure where Gideon had once held unofficial court. The sheriff's badge gleamed with renewed authority, backed now by federal marshals who ensured that territorial law served justice rather than powerful interests. Gideon Blackthorne himself resided in the territorial prison, awaiting trial for decades of documented crimes that Elias's investigation had meticulously catalogued. The cooperative meeting starts in an hour, Violet said, checking the sun's position. Miguel thinks we should expand the irrigation system toward the Rodriguez family's land. Their children need better growing space. Clara nodded, though her attention was drawn to a familiar figure approaching through the green field. Elias Crow walked with the easy stride of someone who had finally found peace after years of wandering. His role as federal investigator had ended with Gideon's arrest, but he had chosen to remain in the territory, drawn by the community they were building around Wheeler's legacy. "Ladies," he said, joining them on the hill with a slight smile that had become more frequent as the months passed. "The morning inspection shows all systems running perfectly. Wheeler's mechanisms are even more remarkable than I initially understood. They're actually improving the soil composition as well as providing irrigation." "Any word from the territorial capital?" Clara asked. Elias's expression grew more serious. "The governor wants to send engineers to study Wheeler's system, possibly replicate it in other regions. There's talk of making this a model community for territorial development." Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Recognition and outside interest could bring prosperity, but it might also attract the kind of attention that had gotten Wheeler killed decades earlier. "Don't worry," Elias said, reading her expression. "The federal protections are ironclad now. Wheeler's bequest specifically prevents any individual or corporation from controlling the water systems. They belong to the community in perpetuity." A bell rang from the town square, calling residents to the weekly cooperative meeting, where decisions about land use, water distribution, and community development were made collectively. Clara watched as people emerged from houses and fields, gathering with the easy familiarity of neighbors who had learned to trust each other's judgment. "We should head down," Violet said. "Today's agenda includes the proposal for the new school. The children deserve better than that cramped room above the general store." As they walked down the hill, Clara reflected on how much had changed since that dusty auction day. She had evolved from foolish widow to respected community leader, But more importantly, she had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. The barn had burned to ashes, but from those ashes had risen something far more valuable than the structure itself, a community built on shared prosperity rather than individual greed. In the town square, Miguel Ramirez was setting up chairs while his wife Maria arranged refreshments that would have been impossible luxuries just months earlier. Their eldest daughter helped younger children find seats, her confident manner showing how quickly the next generation was embracing the new possibilities. Sheriff Briggs approached Clara as the meeting prepared to begin. "Mrs. Weston, there's something I wanted to tell you privately. I received word that 3 other communities have requested federal assistance in investigating water monopolies. Your stand against Gideon has inspired people throughout the territory." Clara felt both pride and responsibility at his work. Wheeler's discovery had transformed more than just their local landscape. It had proved that ordinary people could challenge entrenched power when they stood together with courage and determination. As the cooperative meeting began, Clara took her seat among neighbors who had become family. The agenda covered practical matters, crop rotation schedules, maintenance of the irrigation systems, plans for a proper schoolhouse, and discussions about welcoming new families who were arriving weekly to join their thriving community. But as she listened to the animated discussions and collaborative decision-making, Clara understood that the real treasure hidden in her 30-cent barn had never been Wheeler's mechanical marvels or the abundant water they provided. The true discovery was the proof that communities could govern themselves with wisdom and compassion when they weren't crushed under the boot of unchecked power. When the meeting ended and families dispersed to their afternoon work, Clara remained in the square for a moment, watching children play in streams that sparkled like liquid diamonds in the afternoon sun. Their laughter rose above the steady rhythm of Wheeler's pumps, creating a symphony of contentment that would have seemed impossible on that day when she stood trembling in the auction crowd. Elias joined her as the square emptied, his own expression contemplative. "Do you ever wonder what Wheeler would think of all this?" Clara smiled, watching the water flow channels that nourished dreams as much as crops. "I think he'd be proud that his greatest discovery wasn't riches or power, but the knowledge that some treasures are meant to be shared." As evening approached and the mechanical systems continued their faithful work, Clara walked home through fields that bloomed with possibility. The barn was gone, reduced to ashes and memory, but its legacy flowed through every stream and grew in every field. She had bought a collapsing structure for 30 cents and discovered that the greatest wealth lay not in what could be hoarded, but in what could be given freely to lift an entire community toward hope. The secret of the barn had been revealed at last. True prosperity belonged to everyone, or it belonged to no one at all.